Okay, so get this. Today, we're diving into how women's roles totally changed during World War One. Like you guys have been learning about the suffragettes in year 7 and how they worked so hard to get women the right to vote. Well, this whole time period, World War One, it's like a huge turning point in that whole story.
It really is. Um, you see, before the war, like most people just thought women should stay home, right? Raising kids, taking care of the family, and their lives were pretty much, well, limited to the house.
Yeah, yeah.
But then, boom, the war starts,
Yeah.
and well, everything changes.
It's like all of a sudden the world's like, hold on, women can do way more than we thought.
Right.
With all the men away fighting, somebody had to keep things going back home.
Exactly.
And women, well, they really stepped up big time.
They really did. And what's really interesting is that they ended up doing jobs that, well, nobody ever thought they would. We're talking factories, farms, transportation, even making munitions.
Munitions.
Yeah,
Right.
the weapons and ammunition soldiers need to fight.
Wow. Okay, that's seriously impressive. I'm trying to picture it now. Women working in these massive factories, building all this important stuff for the war effort. It's pretty amazing, right?
It is.
Weren't there posters and things encouraging women to do all this? I think our sources mentioned something about that.
Oh, you're totally right. Those posters were super important. I mean, imagine seeing them everywhere. They showed women in these like factory uniforms,
Yes.
looking all strong and determined, and there were slogans like "do your bit" and things like that.
Good.
Really powerful stuff.
Yeah. It must have made them feel pretty empowered, don't you think?
Oh, for sure. Like they were part of something so much bigger than themselves.
Right. It wasn't just about getting a job. It was about helping their country when it really needed them.
You got it. It totally changed how people saw women. But it wasn't all just factory work and farms.
Oh, right. What else?
Some women took on roles that were even closer to the fighting.
Oh, wow. Like what is...
Like nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers. There were even a few cases of women fighting on the front lines.
Wait, what? Seriously. Women soldiers. Now, that's a story I definitely want to hear more about.
Yeah. There was this amazing woman, Maria Botkareva from Russia. She led a whole battalion of female soldiers. Can you believe that?
Wow. A female battalion leader? That is incredible. She must have been so brave and strong to be able to do that, especially back then.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so it wasn't just in Britain, right? What about American women? What were they doing during the war?
Well, American women played a vital role too. And for African American women, it was a chance for new opportunities. They could move from domestic work to, offices and factories, so many new possibilities.
It's interesting, right? Because even with all this chaos and hardship going on, there were some positive changes happening, especially for women who had, faced even more challenges before the war.
That's a really good point. And even the women who stayed at home, they were still contributing in big ways.
Oh, right.
Our sources mention things like, signing pledges to conserve food and resources.
Ah, right. So everyone could have enough.
Exactly. And they even grew these victory gardens to help with food shortages.
Victory gardens. What are those?
Basically, little gardens they'd plant at home to grow extra food.
Cool. So it sounds like everyone was pulling together and doing whatever they could to support the war effort. But I'm curious, did this whole experience change how society saw women's capabilities? Like, it must have shattered some of those old stereotypes.
Absolutely. It definitely did. I mean, the war proved that women were strong and capable, that they could handle way more responsibility than anyone had ever given them credit for. And, this all ties back to what you're learning about the suffragettes.
Ah, yeah. The fight for women's rights. I can see how it all connects now.
It's all linked, really. This whole period was such a pivotal moment in the fight for equality.
So how did things change for the suffragettes after the war? Did they finally get what they were fighting for?
Well, that's what we're going to dive into next. Stay tuned.
Yeah, I think the war really gave their movement this big push.
Right.
Women showed everyone they could handle tough jobs and, make important decisions. They were contributing to society in all these different ways. And it made it so much harder to say they shouldn't have a say in how their country was run. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. It's like all their hard work during the war just totally underlined how ridiculous those old arguments against women voting were. It must have been incredible for those women to finally see their hard work paying off, right? After years of campaigning and facing all that opposition, even getting arrested. And then, bam, this massive shift happens because of the war.
Absolutely. It must have been so empowering for them. Speaking of powerful women, the story of Edith Cavell, I think, is a really good example. She was a British nurse, you see, and she was working in Belgium when the war broke out.
Belgium, wasn't that where the war kind of kicked off? When Germany invaded. You got it, right at the start of the war. So Edith, she found herself right in the middle of a war zone. But even though it was super dangerous, she was determined to help. She risked her life to help Allied soldiers escape from occupied Belgium. She would guide them to safety in neutral Holland.
Wow, that's so brave. Imagine, being surrounded by enemy soldiers and secretly helping these guys escape. It's like something out of a movie. Did she help many soldiers get away?
Oh, she did. She helped over 200 soldiers escape to safety. But sadly, she was eventually caught by the Germans.
Oh, no. What happened to her?
She was executed for her actions.
Oh, that's so sad. But wow, what an incredible story. I mean, she was willing to risk everything to help other people. It just shows you how strong and determined those women were.
Absolutely. And her story, it really had an impact at the time. It was a reminder of, well, of the human cost of war and the courage of those who, those who stood up for what they believed in. There are also amazing stories from the communication front. Have you ever heard of the Hello Girls?
Hello, girls. Okay, now that name definitely has me intrigued. What's that all about?
Well, communication was, it was vital during the war.
Right.
The U.S. Army needed a way to connect with their troops in Europe, a reliable way. So they ended up creating this special unit of female telephone operators, and they became known as the Hello Girls.
Wow, so they were literally keeping the lines of communication open during the war. That's a huge responsibility. Just imagine trying to connect calls and all that chaos.
Yeah.
With the noise and the battles going on, that must have been pretty intense.
Intense is one word for it. These women were, they were highly skilled. They had to be fluent in both French and English and work these crazy long hours under pressure. And, they were often super close to the front lines.
Wow, fluent in 2 languages, working under pressure.
Yeah.
They were like superstars. It makes you realize how much depended on them. They were playing such a crucial role in the whole war effort.
Yeah, they really were. And here's the interesting part. Even though they wore uniforms and, they followed all the military rules, they served their country so bravely, well, when they got home, they weren't officially recognized as veterans.
Wait, seriously? They weren't given veteran status? But why? I mean, they did so much.
Well, at the time, you see the military, they were just slow to acknowledge women's contributions as, as equal to men's contributions.
Yes, great.
They had to fight for recognition, and it took a long time. It wasn't until 1977.
1977.
Decades later, that's when these Hello Girls were finally acknowledged as the veterans they always were.
That's amazing that it took so long. I mean, all those brave women waiting decades to be recognized for their service. It makes you realize that sometimes the fight for equality, it takes a really long time. And you have to be, really determined.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked about the women who went to work in factories and farms, and those incredible nurses and those Hello Girls on the communication front lines. But what about all the women who stayed at home but didn't work in factories? What were their lives like during the war?
Yeah, even for them, life was completely different because of the war. They had a whole set of new challenges to deal with.
Oh, I bet. With their husbands and fathers and brothers all the way fighting, it must have been so stressful for those women.
You can say that again. They suddenly had to, manage their homes all on their own.
Yeah.
And often with very limited resources, because of the rationing and everything.
Oh, right. Things like food and fuel and clothing must have been really hard to come by.
They were. Those women had to be so resourceful and adapt quickly, to all the shortages and changes.
It must have felt like a totally different world. And on top of that, they were trying to keep their families going, looking after the kids and keeping everyone's spirits up while their loved ones were, away fighting. Talk about pressure.
You're absolutely right. They were the anchors of their families, providing comfort and support during those really tough times.
Wow. It sounds like they were juggling so much. And with this constant worry in the back of their minds about what was happening to their loved ones.
Absolutely. Their stories, they might not be as, as dramatic as the nurses on the front lines or the women in factories, but they are still so important, They were the unsung heroes on the home front, keeping their families and communities together.
I think that's a really important point. It wasn't just about the jobs women did during the war, but about how they held everything together during such a challenging time. They showed incredible strength.
You said it. They were the backbone of society during those years. Their contributions were often overlooked, but without them, the whole war effort would have been so much more difficult.
It makes you think about how heroism comes in all different forms, doesn't it? It's not always about being on the front lines, but about those everyday acts of courage, like keeping your family going when everything feels so uncertain. But speaking of change, let's talk about what happened after the war. I mean, it couldn't have all just gone back to normal, right? It feels like everything was just kind of shaken up, you know?
Hmm.
Like the war forced everyone to see women in a whole new light. So did things just go back to the way they were before? Or did those changes actually stick around?
That's the big question, isn't it? Did all that progress just disappear? Thankfully, no. The war, well, it really had a lasting impact on how society viewed women.
Okay, so it wasn't like a light switch, right? Where everything suddenly went back to the way it was.
Exactly. It was more gradual. But women had proved themselves, right? They'd shown everyone they were capable and strong. They'd kept everything running. They'd filled all those vital roles. Some had even served on the front line, so there was no going back to pretending they weren't capable of all that.
Yeah. It's like society had a wake-up call and was like, whoa, women are amazing. We need to give them more credit.
Exactly. And that realization, well, it really sparked a wave of change. And one of the biggest changes was that women finally won the right to vote in many countries.
That's huge. So it's like the war really helped push that over the line. After all those years of the suffragettes fighting for it, it finally happened.
You could definitely say that. The war, it provided undeniable proof of women's abilities, and that helped change people's minds about giving women the vote. But it's really important to remember that, well, getting the right to vote was just one step.
Right, because even with the vote, there were still so many other areas where women, well, they weren't treated equally.
Exactly. It was just the beginning. There was still so much work to do in terms of equal pay and access to education and just having more control over their own lives, those battles. They continued for many years after the war.
So it's like the war opened a door, but women still had to fight really hard to walk through it
Yeah,
and to have the same opportunities as men.
that's a great way to put it. But we can't forget how far things had come. The war, it was a turning point. It really set things in motion for women in the 20th century and beyond.
I know. It's amazing to think about how something as awful as a war could actually lead to some positive changes for women.
It's true, it is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? But sometimes it takes something massive, something that really shakes things up to make people reevaluate their beliefs. And all those women who stepped up during the war, they were the ones who really made that change happen.
It makes you wonder, like, what would the world be like today if those women hadn't been so brave? If they hadn't challenged those old ideas about what women could and couldn't do.
That's a really interesting question. It's hard to say for sure, but I think it's safe to say that the world would be a very different place. Their courage and resilience really paved the way for future generations.
Well, it's definitely been inspiring to learn about all these incredible women. It shows us that even in those really, really dark times, people can still achieve amazing things, right? And create positive change.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter who we are or what challenges we're facing.
So to all you year sevens out there, I have a question for you to think about. Imagine yourself living during World War I. What kind of role would you have taken on? And how do you think the war would have changed your life?
It's a great question to reflect on. And as you do, think about the bravery of all those amazing women like Edith Cavell and the Hello Girls and so many others. Maybe you'll even feel inspired to learn more about them and all their incredible stories.
I think that's a great idea. There's so much more to discover about this time in history. And remember, by learning about the past, we can help create a better future. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of women in World War I.
It's been great exploring this fascinating topic with you. Until next time.